Hey everybody, it's John Ederola for the Young Turks. I want to thank you for joining me. In this video, we're going to be talking about some of the reforms that have been announced for the Baltimore police departments and also the results of the DOJ investigation into Chicago, which is unearthed and detailed absolutely massive constitutional violations of rights and civil liberties. This is a video that I said at the end of the live show today. We wanted to get it on the live show. We didn't quite have time in the first hour. And so as I go through these, there's a lot of graphics. And so I apologize in advance. It's not like the regular show. You're not going to be able to see the actual text. And so I apologize for that. But there's a lot of important information here that I want to make sure we get right. Now, in the first case, we have the Justice Department investigation of the Baltimore Police Department. Now, I think you all know that this wide-scale investigation was launched as a result of what happened with Freddie Gray, and there have been a number of different trials of some of the police officers involved in that. Very often, no justice actually coming out of those trials. But this DOJ investigation is actually incredibly interesting because of its description of some of the abuses of the police departments there. And then also, more importantly here, we have a number of reforms that are going to be put into place. And so we're going to go through some of them, try to evaluate how much this could actually improve the situation in Baltimore. Obviously, this is early information, but it is at least something. And so the Justice Department final report that came out earlier today goes back to the effect of some of the zero-tolerance policing that was put into effect back in the 1990s, actually, under Mayor Martin O'Malley, which I think is interesting. The purpose of these policies were to reduce crime, but what they actually ended up doing in practice was putting thousands and thousands of people into jail that should never have actually been there. And they found that had a long-standing effect up until the present, not just on the population of Baltimore, but also on the police departments, and set up a much more confrontational attitude between those police departments and the people of Baltimore. And you'll find that outside of just the zero-tolerance policing, that eventually trickled out into a number of other areas of policing. And so the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division head, Vanita Gupta, releases a statement. Here's just a small section saying the city and the Baltimore Police Department will implement comprehensive reforms to end the legacy of Baltimore's zero-tolerance policing, and in its place, Baltimore is empowering officers to engage in proactive, community-oriented policing. That's just words. I mean, it's great, and it's coming at the end of an awesome report by the DOJ, but what I really want to talk about is the actual reforms that are being put into place. So there's this agreement that's been set up between the DOJ and the BPD. Here are some details. The agreement discourages the arrests of citizens for quality of life offenses such as loitering, littering, or minor traffic violations. It also requires a supervisor to sign off on requests to take someone into custody for a minor infraction. Now that may seem small, but that's actually incredibly important. Because when you tell police that they're supposed to be out on the lookout for these incredibly minor offenses like loitering and littering and things like that, and yes, some of these can be crimes, but when they're going out there looking for them, then what they're being trained to do is to see the everyday citizens of their city as an enemy, basically. They're someone that they're supposed to be in conflict with. And if you're trying to find people to lock up for these small things, well then that's the attitude you're going to develop towards your own population, and of course that's not healthy. But they go farther than that. The agreement mandates basic training for making stops and searches. It also commands officers to use de-escalation techniques, thoroughly investigate sexual assault claims, and send specially trained units to distress calls involving people with mental illnesses. And all three of those are incredibly important developments. We've been talking for, it feels like years now, on the fact that police departments outside of the U.S., especially in Europe, do focus on de-escalation. Both the physical but also the psychological techniques of trying to avoid conflict from actually happening in the first place. But here in the U.S., we seem to go into these conflicts where you send a police officer to deal with someone. They are instantly worried for their life and believe that if there's any even implied threat, then you have to instantly take the person down with lethal force all too often. And so de-escalation techniques are incredibly important in trying to limit that. And I think that when you listen to a lot of former police officers working for reform, like Michael Wood Jr., very often he talks about that too. Thoroughly investigating sexual assault claims is obviously a very different area of policing where a lot of people feel that there has been wide-scale injustice and lack of follow-up on crimes that have been committed. So I'm glad that they're fitting that in as well. And then sending specially trained units to distress calls involving people with mental illnesses. I mean, we've seen the result of not doing this all too often, where a family member calls up the police because they have a family member who's perhaps with them or has stopped responding to their calls, and they're worried about that person's safety. That person might have said that they're going to hurt themselves or something to that effect. And then they send police there, and the police, because the person is by their very nature acting erratically, sometimes respond instantly with violence. And we've seen all too many people who were killed because their family members called for them to receive help. And so sending specially trained people is going to be safer for the police, but also, more importantly in this case, for the civilians as well. There's other things, important attitudinal changes that the Baltimore Police Department will have to take up. Police will not be able to stop someone just because the person is in a high crime area or just because the person is trying to avoid contact with an officer. Now, both of those, for people who don't live in an area where the police are in this sort of relationship with their citizens, might seem like ridiculous things to have to stipulate, but those things go on in a lot of cities, including Baltimore. And what you have there is, very often when a fatal shooting of a civilian happens, an unarmed civilian, they will say he tried to flee, or we were looking for someone else in this area. And look, I'm not saying that in some cases that's not the case, but very often that's a convenient excuse for conflicts that didn't need to escalate in the way that they did. And so taking that away as a philosophical foundation for the way police officers work day to day, I think can be an important next step. But there's also a lot of other reforms. Now, we're talking about a massive document, and obviously these are summaries, but they're important in practice. The decree also mandates community oversight, very important. You get more civilians into the mix, that's going to be important, although we found that, like with jury trials of police officers, all too often civilians are deferential to police authority. New recruitment policies, that can be important as well. I mean, you want to have people who look like and represent the group that they're policing. Additional training on stop, searches, and arrests. As we said, an emphasis on de-escalation. Sexual assault investigations that promote victim-centered, trauma-informed approach and combat gender bias. I'm sure some conservatives, their heads will explode when they hear it described in that way, but that is also important. Now, look, the proof of the pudding is in the tasting, as they say. And so in this case, it's great that the DOJ conducted their investigation, which, by the way, took over 13 months. It was incredibly thorough. And now they have their list of recommendations. But the recommendations actually need to be acted on, not just formally, but in practice day to day by the police. And so hopefully they have people on the police side who are willing to make a good faith effort to actually put these things into effect. Now, Baltimore is not the only city that's been in the news today, over the last 48 hours, I should say, over DOJ investigations. You also have Chicago. Now, Chicago is, in a lot of ways, in terms of its crime, an absolute disaster, unparalleled by other cities in the U.S. in a lot of ways. I mean, we're talking about more murders in a single year than L.A. and New York combined, which are massive cities. But while there's a lot of crime, there's also a lot of police abuses of authority. And so another massive DOJ investigation has concluded, and here's some information that they found. There's a lot of these, but they're all important. And this is the cut-down version. I had way more that I wanted to read here. Officers often engaged in dangerous foot chases that often ended with officers unreasonably shooting someone, including unarmed individuals, they found. Gang members were taken to a rival gang's neighborhood as a way of scaring them into providing information. That's cruel and unusual there. Tasers were used against people who posed no threat, not a low threat. The investigation found they were used against people who posed absolutely no threat, which means that in a lot of cases it was used as a punishment, as a way of burning off stress after a chase or after a fight, something like that. Morale was low throughout the department, and officers felt abandoned by the public and the city. That conclusion obviously is more sympathetic towards the police department, although there can be reasons based in police activity that sort of thing happens, of course. The city did not adequately review use of force incidents to determine if they were necessary. Now, this is just a short little sentence, but that's incredibly important because what you had in Chicago and have in a number of other cities is widespread complaints filed against police officers, allegations of racism and discrimination of various forms, and what you find is that very, very few of them, incredibly small single-digit number, are investigated. And so when you're talking about violence being used against civilians, the idea that they would so casually brush off so many of them, that may be one reason that morale ends up being low in a police department. Let's see, a little bit more from the investigation. This is, let's see. We found that officers shoot at vehicles without justification and in contradiction to CPD policy. We found further that officers exhibit poor discipline when discharging their weapons and engage in tactics that endanger themselves and public safety, including failing to await backup when they safely could and should, using unsound tactics in approaching vehicles, and using their own vehicles in a manner that is dangerous. That last bit there, by the way, we've done multiple videos during my time at TYT, literal dashcam footage of police officers intentionally running over people with their vehicles. That's amongst the most difficult to watch videos that we've covered. But you're seeing there that in a number of ways, the police officers are unnecessarily endangering themselves, putting themselves in a situation that when they end up in that situation, very often they will use lethal force or non-lethal force when there's no justification whatsoever. A little bit more. Federal investigators who reviewed hundreds of investigative files found that civilian and officer witnesses, and even the accused officers, are frequently not interviewed during an investigation, which seems like the first thing that you would do is talk to the witnesses, especially before their memories start to fade over time. Maybe talk to the people who've been accused in these investigations, but it turns out that very often they don't do that. The city investigators also frequently failed to collect basic evidence and have allowed union representatives and attorneys to coach officers in the middle of recorded interviews, with official protocols actually prohibiting investigators from preventing this or even referring to it on tape. Now, the problem is that the actual tapes have been released. I've read the transcripts from some of them, and what you have is the questioning of a police officer who was involved in an incident, very often resulting in the use of deadly force, and they clearly are talking in one way, then being whispered to or corrected by their lawyers, in some cases police union lawyers, and then contradicting themselves or trying to reframe an argument after they've been advised in a particular way in which to do so. And the fact that the investigators there are not allowed to correct for this or even mention that's going on, the entire purpose of that is to stop people from understanding how this process actually works. And so it's amazing. It's great that the DOJ actually did that investigation and have laid it out in such clear detail. Now, as I said, both in terms of the reforms in Baltimore and the DOJ investigation, the findings in Chicago, these are the minor Cliff's notes of all that's there. And this is some dark stuff. People have been tweeting out particular sections in terms of case studies of interactions between Chicago police and unarmed suspects, where they will make claims about what a suspect was doing that are in no way verifiable or directly contradicted by the evidence, and then they will stick with that story. Despite the fact that it resulted in the death of a person who was never injured, they'll say, there was one in particular that I can't get out of my mind, where they said the guy was armed. They didn't find a gun on the person. They ended up finding a gun within, I think, a half mile away, but the gun didn't have the person's fingerprints on them and had never been discharged, despite the fact that the police said that when they were firing dozens of bullets at the person, it was in response to that citizen firing at them. The only gun they were found was nowhere near the person and was fully loaded at the time that they found it and lacking the fingerprints of the person that they said fired at the police officers. Now, will the reforms in Baltimore actually end up being followed? I don't know. Will the investigation in Chicago lead to reforms that can actually make a significant difference in that city? I have no idea. But in an area where, in the 5 years that I've worked in the news, there has been very little positive change, very little cause for optimism for the future. These are two sets of good news coming from different cities, some of the cities with the most crime problems in the U.S. right now. And so this is certainly a good day if you care about the criminal justice system and want to see it move towards an area in which it is more just. So I want to thank you for joining me. I said I would do this on the main show. I'm glad that so many of you have waited around or retuned in. If you want more information of this sort and many other topics, I very often will tweet out articles, some of which I don't get to actually comment on in videos, at John Idarola on Twitter. You can also follow me on YouTube at the two different channels that I host. That is youtube.com/thinktank for much lighter content, generally non-political content, or youtube.com/John Idarola for more videos about politics and news when I'm able to do that. So anyway, thank you for joining me. I'll see you in the next one, guys.